I'm actually going to start. Um, I'm going to start by talking about two things that this story isn't about, I think. Um, and in the course of those two things, I may digress a little into some larger issues about how we read the biblical text. And then after that, I'll get a little bit more to what I think this story is doing, or at least some of the things I see in it. But I want to start with a couple of things that this story isn't. The first thing that I think this story isn't, I do not think that this is a story explaining why it is that Israelites don't sacrifice their children. There's a very common belief um, that this is what we call an etiology, right? A story that explains something. An etiology for this sort of unique Israelite prohibition against child sacrifice. And it is, the story is often held up, and this notion of like everybody around Israel was sacrificing children, but not Israel, right? Not the Bible. Look at this story. It's often held up as like one of the advances of the Bible over against its pagan, Israel's pagan neighbors. Uh, and I'm going to digress immediately. I want to take a second to talk about that kind of language and that kind of idea, like the Israel or the Bible being advanced over its neighbors. Uh, this is a kind of thing that we call biblical exceptionalism, right? Not so different from notions of American exceptionalism. Um, uh, it's biblical exceptionalism, the idea that Israel and the Bible were better than everyone else, right? More ethical than their neighbors, um, more moral than their neighbors, without saying, right, more monotheistic than their neighbors. Though I might suggest that actually, when we say that, we're equating monotheistic with a certain kind of morality or ethics. So it's kind of all the same thing. You can understand the rationale for those kinds of claims. Why are we like this and not like those other folks? We want there to be a reason for why we are the way that we are. Um, this is actually not unlike the conversation we had last week about Abraham, right? Abraham, according to traditions, must have had something about him, some qualities that made him worthy. And of course, we do the same thing, maybe even more strongly with King David, just to name someone whom I happen to have also written about. King David, who, right, is kind of not the best guy ever, even in the biblical account, but we sort of justify all of David's flaws, through our tradition, right, because he's our ancestor. Um, so I suggest we do the same thing with sort of the Bible writ large, right? We come from the Bible, so of course the Bible's better. Of course, ancient Israel is better. I want to suggest that Israel wasn't actually any better than its neighbors, or even particularly different. Whether we look at the sort of social organization of the society, from the family unit all the way up through the broadest sort of hierarchical, like the monarchy, um, just like all of their neighbors, uh, their cultic practices, down to their very the sacrifices that they offer, basically the same as all their neighbors, especially the ones who lived closest to them in Canaan. Uh, Adherence to one national deity, right, who is the God of our people, same as the neighbors, right? Uh, you know, the Moabites right next door, they had their national god. Their god was named Chemosh. Israel's god was named Yahweh. But the way they understood their relationship to their god was pretty much exactly the same, even down to the fact that, at least in early periods of Israel and what we call biblical period, they weren't monotheistic in the way that we say monotheistic. Belief that there was only one God out there, but they were what we call monolatrous. That is, they only worshipped one deity, right? One national deity. Israel in that way and in all these other ways was basically just like its neighbors, which isn't to say that Israel didn't have unique features. Of course, Israel had unique features. Uh, Unlike its neighbors, Israel did not have a statue of the deity in its sanctuaries, right? If you were to go into a sanctuary of any of these other deities, these other nations, you'd find statues of their gods, in the central part of the sanctuary. In an Israelite sanctuary, as far as we know, you wouldn't find one. That's a substantial difference. It's also like one of the only different, like real big differences that I could come up with when I was trying to think of some. But to think about is not having a statue a sign of moral or ethical progress? I would say not really, right? We think it is only because we've sort of justified it as so, right? We've proclaimed the absence of a statue to be morally or ethically superior to having a statue. But there's no sort of like objective rationale for that, I don't think. Right? It's having a statue, not having a statue is just a difference, right? Presumably every culture had some things that made it, unique or different from its neighbors. The trajectory of religious history, right, isn't one of like winning versus losing, right? Like our monotheistic ideas won out over the polytheistic, or the no statue in the sanctuary won against the losing side of having statues in the sanctuary, right? Ancient religion wasn't like a marketplace of ideas where like the better or truer faith conquered the lesser ones. Beliefs come along with people, and the beliefs we hold up as better today are just the ones that like made it, and the ones that made it are the ones attached to the people who made it. Right? So why Israel and Yahweh rather than say Moab and Chemosh? Right? Why do we think Israel was better and Moab not? Because Moab was wiped out and Israel happened to survive, and we happen to be descended from it. Israel didn't survive as opposed to Moab because Israel had better beliefs than the Moabites. Maybe better jokes than the Moabites. Unclear. But right, it wasn't because Israel's monotheism or Yahweh worship or lack of statues. That's not why we survived. Not why Israel survived as opposed to Moab. The point is, right, this even within Israel itself, right? The Dead Sea Scroll community, if they had been the ones to survive rather than what we now call sort of rabbinic Judaism or Pharisaic Judaism, if the Dead Sea Scroll community had made it, we would all be totally different now. And we would think that they were right, the right ones. My point is, history isn't linear, progressing smoothly from point A to point Z. There's a million branches at every step, and the one that gets taken isn't taken by choice. It's all just contingent, right? And it's usually contingent on external forces. All of which is to say, at the end of this little mini lecture at the beginning that has nothing to really much to do with our text, we should stop using the language of biblical exceptionalism. Oh, there, I brought it back to the text again. Israel was an ancient Near Eastern culture, pretty much like all of its neighbors. We just happen to be descended from this particular subculture rather than from the other ones. That doesn't make it or us better, right? We're just happen to be descended from the survivors, right? To say that we're better is basically like claiming superiority over the dead.